So I think we can start now. We can kick start. Hi everyone, good day, good morning, good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you are joining from. My name is Balogun David Taiwo. I work as a data analytics specialist and AI consultant. Having worked over the last 4 or 5 years and built my experience across working in different industry, cut across the fintech, the edtech, the sustainability industry, clean tech, and most importantly, the earth tech, which is more or less like my major priority, more or less like, giving back to society and, you know, betterment of the community, the data ecosystem at large, global ecosystem. And I've had opportunity to speak at some global events. And yeah, it's just great to be here. And I think I would have to once again thank the organizers of this event. All right. So that is just a bit about myself, and you can search me online, look me up online, or just check me up on LinkedIn to get more information about me. So let me try and minimize this so I can maximize my screen. Great. So welcome and section good. So welcome to this section. So our goal is to help you make smart, content-driven choice across a Microsoft expansive data platforms such as your Power BI, your Azure Synapse, and your SQL Server to Fabrics. And knowing fully well that we are in the data world now, and there are a lot of data tech stacks tools out there to use, more or less like data platform and all that. And sometimes genuinely it can be overwhelming. And I think Microsoft as an industry has done really well for in trying to help us encompass everything in building like a very robust tools we can all use basically. So what we are going to be working through, so we'll be working through common data challenge and how to have different Microsoft tools address them, decision making framework to avoid overkill and underpower situation. Also, we'll be looking at real world scenarios and trade-off for analytical storage transformation and governance. Also, tips on balancing cost, complexity, and performance, which I think is important most times for startup and for your organization. Ultimately, you're trying to reduce cost and of course trying to make sure you are being optimal in terms of production and being effective. At the end of this section, you will be equipped to choose the right tools for the right job confidently, effectively, and strategically. So why two selections matter? So before I go into here, I'm just more or less like want to share a quick story. So sometimes I think 2 months ago, 3 months ago, one of the startups in which I work, we had like a major change transition in which kind of affected the finance of the organization, and we had to downsize in terms of cost infrastructure, right? So we were kind of heavy on Google product and Microsoft's, right? I mean, engineering team was majorly focused on the Google product, while data team was focused on Microsoft product, for instance, right? So we had to just break down on cost. And one of the major decisions I took then was, trying to cut down on our cloud storage architecture in order to reduce our cost and ultimately not affecting the level of production, which ultimately I can say is more or less like an external factor when you're trying to consider your costs or the kind of tools you should, go for. So we're looking at impact of wrong choice and benefit of right choice, right? So when we look at the impact of the wrong choice, we are looking at wasted time and increased cost, low team morale and project delay, technical debt and misalignment. And if we are going to look at the benefits, we'll be looking at improved system performance, accelerated delivery, and reduced expenses. And also we'll be looking at boosted team productivity and faster insight. Right. So one of the mistakes I think I've seen most people in the data space make over time is using the wrong tool. And it's something I think I see over time, and I think I more or less stumbled on it on one article I was reading on Medium long ago there. A data scientist or a data analyst or a data specialist or a consultant, whichever field you fall into, is not the person that knows how to use all the tools ultimately, but is the person that knows the best tools to use at a particular point in time, right? I've kind of had conversation with people over time, and they will tell me they know how to they can make use of different tools, but you're trying to solve some basic problem. You don't know the best tools to handle it, and there would be problem of which tools should I use, and if you don't know the tools to use, it's going to ultimately affect or impact on your cost, right? So sometimes organization will just taking some unnecessary tools, which will ultimately increase their pricing and their costing. And at the end of the day, they will see that they don't need it for their efficiency or productivity, right? And they will probably have to go back in cutting it, which is important sometimes having a more in-depth person, which have kind of, infrastructural understanding, be it from a data perspective or from a software point of view. So we go straight into today's roadmap. We're looking at Microsoft Data Stack Overview, Core Tools Deep Dive, Real Life Case Study, Decision Making and Best Practices Scale. All right, so we're starting with Microsoft Data Stack. And a shout out to Microsoft. I think I have to say this. So Microsoft have made life easy for the data world. Trust me, data world, starting from their different tools you can use for making decisions for engineering, data engineering, the low-code tools that I have there for engineering purposes, for data engineering purposes. All right, so Microsoft Data Stack is a comprehensive ecosystem of tools and services designed to support the entire data lifecycle from raw injection to actionable insights. So this is taken from the point of in which I would consider as more or less like a data engineering phase to the analytical phase, right? So trying to inject your data, the pipeline, the work data flow, and all that to the point in which you are making your report or your visuals to your stakeholders or your consumers, whichever case might fall into. So looking at our injection orchestration tool, so we have the Azure Factory Synapse Pipeline Fabric data flow for efficient data loading, which is pretty cool. I have kind of had instances of using these tools, right? And I will just give us more or less like a real insight today. So looking at tools like this and comparing it to what we have in the core engineering space, right? The robust engineering space of having like your BigQuery, having like your Docker, you're trying to roll out your data, you're trying to make it real life and all of that. So Microsoft are kind of make it very effortless for us. And I think one of the major importance of what Microsoft is building over time is low code, right? So low code, you don't have to leverage so much on your technical depth of writing code and all that. So another one I'll be looking at is the storage, which is more or less tied to your database. So we have the Azure Data Lake storage, we have the SQL database, we have the Commons DB and Dataverse, right? Dataverse is tied more like, when I think I've made use of Dataverse over time along my Power BI. So when we are looking at transformation and processing, so we have our Spark in Fabric, our Azure Synapse, and for making your transformation. So more or less like that is, I tell people over time, I kind of classify that as more or less like the ICU of data intensive care. So that is where the real work is going in terms of transforming your data, processing your data. And over time, for my research over time, I've discovered that, a data scientist, a data analyst, data engineer, so far in the data field or in the data profession, you literally spend most or more of your time trying to transform your data. All right. The point of trying to, visualize your data is just a little fraction, but transforming of your data will take chunk of your time. We'll be looking at also the modeling and semantics. So we're having stuff like analysis service, Power BI dataset, and fabric layouts, lakehouse, and warehouse. Also, looking at our visualization tool, which ultimately I think a lot of us will be familiar with the word Power BI, right, for visualization and Excel integration for for your analytics, your basic analytics. So shout out to the likes of Power BI and also Excel. Microsoft Excel pretty much doing well in that space, for your analytics, your visualization. And I think one important one there, again, I would have to mention is data governance and security, all right, which is just more or less tied around your compliance, your data privacy, and all that. And Microsoft is doing well in that space in terms of Microsoft peer review for catalog and compliance. So making sure there is 100% compliance, right, and making sure there is no data leakage out there, so people don't leverage on important data. All right, so we move straight to the injection layout. I think I have 45 minutes. So I'll try and make it snappy and also make it very more interesting. The injection layout. So when we look at the injection layout is where the data journey begins, right? So more or less like the foundational step, whichever way you want to put it. The main objective here is to bring your data into the environment efficiently and secure it and it being reliable, right? From from your basic or from the basic step, basically. So, sometimes you're trying to get your data from a third party API, you're trying to get it from an external source, for instance, you're trying to get it from a web application, a mobile application, and all that. So, that's more or less like, the basic step there, which would go through your ADF, which is your Azure Data Factory. So, ideally, batch processing and, schedule injection from structured and semi-structured processes of data. So when we mean structured data, just typically means your data coming in rows and columns, right? So you're trying to get in your data every time. All right. So with the help of your Azure Data Factory, you can, do that. And it also supports in complex ETL, which is just extract and transforming and loading of your data with minimal code. And if you could remember, I said in the previous slide or previous two slides that Microsoft is building something amazing in terms of low code tools, right? So you don't have to. I write code, for instance, and times I'm trying to do integration and all that. It can be mind blowing, right? Running into servers of bugs and all that. I was writing a code with Docker, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, and I just had to spend like chunk of the hour trying to debug most of the codes and on my terminal because of errors and all that. All right, so we're looking at our Synapse pipeline, which is very important. So this is used for integrating into Synapse, right? Great for combining orchestration with transformation and analytics in one unified workspace. So this is more or less like a pipeline, right? So which is collecting or gathering the data. So more or less like a work flow, sort of, in which the data can go in effortlessly, and all thanks to the ADF that started the process. So another one we look at here is Azure Event Hub, which is, we can call it AE, um, AEH. So best suited for real-time streaming, right? So like your IoT, for instance, your IoT data handling massive data, for instance, is with low tenancy. So when you are dealing with real-time data, so with the help of your Azure Event Hub, right? So it's kind of work along. So maybe a CML tools like HubSpot, for instance, if you make use of HubSpot, do for you too, just in case you've made use of HubSpot. So just a bit relatable. So we have the data flow too. When we look at the data flow, so it's more or less like, the more service, a low code options, right, for injection and preparing your data within the Power BI or Fabrics, ideally for business users. So more or less like I kind of classify it most times as the end report or the end users, right? So that is where the end users kind of fall into. So you're trying to make a report to your stakeholders, to your management, your clients for consulting, thereabout. So these are like the last step or the last phase you will kind of ideally come across with the help of your Power BI for presentation or your analytics. So moving on to storage layer overview. So I think it's important most times when we look at your storage layer, knowing fully well that when you're having your data, you have to have them being stored properly, right? So you don't want instances of your data, you don't want instances of data leakage, you don't want instances of data um, leakage, right? And ultimately tying it down to data privacy, to making sure that not necessary stakeholders don't have access to those data. So you don't want to imagine this instances, you as the database administrator or database manager being loose on the data, and some other people within the organization who are not supposed to have access to the data can easily have access to it. So when we look at our storage layer, so it's critical for ensuring that your data is not just stored, but also accessible, secure, and optimized for how it is being used. All right. So when I mean optimized, which is very important, making sure you're just putting in the details that is being needed, not unnecessary details, for instance, right? So I might be storing my data in JSON, for instance. Now, in fact, in point of storing my data in JSON, I should make sure I'm not putting in unnecessary data. I'm just putting in maybe the object that is being needed in there, more or less like the arrays, right? Taking away the unimportant part of it. So the goal is to keep it accessible, scalable, which is very important. And I think to make it a bit balanced, right? So you don't want to get to pay a high price for a low storage, for instance, because you are keeping unnecessary data. So making sure you are keeping the optimal data that is needed. Anyone that is not needed, you don't get to store it, right? Just only the important data. Then we have So we can look at it from a place of Azure SQL database, Azure data lake storage, and Snap dedicated SQL pool. But I think one of the major used one that I've used over time is Azure SQL database, which I think is pretty much good for OLTP workload and reporting layers, right? So when you're dealing with reporting layers, so I think it can be really good. And the data vars, right, which is a need to that have been in place by Power BI. So more or less like your platform, your Power Platform, and your Dynamic 365, right? Some of us are familiar with Dynamics 365, maybe for people in the finance and a bit of accounting world, right? So they are a great app for knitting and integrating, your low-code data storage. So you are trying to store minimum data, not so much of data. You can use tools like this in storing it. So we'll be looking at the transformation layer. All right, so we started with the storage layer overview, then we'll be moving to this transformation layer overview. So when we look at the transformation layer overview, so we'll be looking at transformation layer focus on cleaning, enriching, and preparing data. So if you could remember previously, I made mention of ICU, right? So it's just more or less like a way of knowing how powerful the transformation layer is, right? So I just kind of easily can, liken it to the likes of Power Query in your Power BI, for instance. Power Query is more or less like where you do the heavy lifting of cleaning of your data ultimately in your Power BI. All right, so transformation layer overview. So the transformation layer overview focus on cleaning, enriching, and preparing your data, making it ready for consumption by downstreaming analytics and reporting tools. So when I'm trying to focus on my part of analytics, so this is something you need to sort, right? So cleaning your data, refining it, reshaping it, combining it, enriching it, and aggregating it, right? So aggregating in terms of summarizing the data. If you have to do some summary about the data, you have to do that basically. So keynotes included here, basically it tells your Azure data factory, your Synapse also. So choosing the right tools depend on the data complexity, transformation logic, and the person in charge, right? So maybe a data engineer, a data analyst. But one thing I tell people most times is you should genuinely have like a data engineer within your team, within the data team. The role of a data engineer, I know sometimes we can want to double roll up as a data analyst and data engineer, to just juggle stuff together. But trust me, most times it's better you have everyone independent sorting out their stuff. As a data engineer, I'm focused on the architecture, the infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure optimization, and all that. While the analyst is focused on the analytical view, reporting flow, optimizing of reports, and how you can enrich the reports basically. So we'll be moving straight to our analytical and reporting layer overview. I think I've mentioned a bit of this. So we'll be starting with the Power BI. So the analytical and reporting layer overview is where the raw data is finalized, transformed into actionable insight, right? And I think this is more or less like the front end. If I'm to use an engineering term, so I would describe this as the front end. So these two, the storage layer overview and the transformation layer, are more or less like the back end. People don't get to see this, right? So what they get to see most times is the analytical and reporting layer overview. And most of the work is being done in the first stage, which is the storage layer overview and the transformation layer overview, right? And this is more or less like the third stage, which is more or less like the front end. And the reason why I'm referring to it as the front end is because that is where you get to relate with stakeholders, right? Your managers, your C-suite level managers, your clients, your consulting firm, and whatsoever you are interacting with. So the primary goal is to deliver clear, accurate, and timely information to the right stakeholders. All right. And some of the tools here, we have our Power BI, which is business intelligence. For visualization, for your analytics, we can also leverage on our Excel, right? So in as much you can make it of Excel, Excel is not, I would not say, no disrespect to Excel, but Excel is not optimal when it comes to stuff like this. I would rather say you use Power BI or you make use of your Azure analysis service. All right. And ultimately, it's based on your pricing, organization demand, organization preference, and costing. All right. Organization might be looking to cut down on their pricing, for instance, or for our operational costs, we are spending X amounts on a yearly basis. We want to reduce it to X amount. Right. So it might have a large implication on the costing and ultimately bringing down the tools we use now to just maybe some minimal tools. All right. So when we look at injection, so we look at Azure Data Factory. So why choose Azure Data Factory? So we can choose it for your batch, ETL, extract, transform, and loading, right? So it's excellent for scheduling, data scheduling, right? So where you have instances of scheduling of your data, so your data is coming in real time, in batches, in sets, and all that. So you can leverage on your Azure Data Factory for that. So it's going to help you handle the data. So I mean, we are talking about local tools here, right? I mean, if you were to take it on a more advanced level, you might probably want to do a bit of integration with your Docker, set it up with your database and all that. But Azure Data Factory would perfectly do that, and it can also take in large amount of data, periodic data load, right, from your data, diverse data source, from different source, from a third-party application, from your API, plugging it straight to an API, whatsoever source you are getting it from. When we look at connectivity, so connect hundreds of data source on the premises and cloud, right? So I think I've also mentioned this, right? So you can make connection to different sources of your data. You can get your data from different sources, right? And it's going to be real time, very accurate. So there is no issue. There is not going to be issue instances of data. The data isn't loading well, or there are instances of missing data not coming in real time. You would not have issues like that. So in order to sum this up or to summarize this, so ADF is ideal for organization building robust, scalable, and manageable data pipeline across hybrid environments, offering flexibility and control over data movement and transformation. So this is something you should note, right? So it's very flexible, it's very robust, and I think this is the future of data when you talk of more of data integration, right? Injection and integration. So data, Azure Data Factory is more or less like the future of it, I would say. All right, so I'm going to skip this. So transformation layer overview. So when we look at the transformation layer overview, so we are looking at transforming layers, turning raw data into usable structure and trustworthy information, ready for reporting and analytics or modeling. And I said something across, ideally you should have your data engineer stand alone. Also have your analytics team stand alone. But of course, there are rooms for collaboration, right? So having sure that everyone is independent, working effectively, right? So the engineer, for instance, should focus on, loading of the data, data injection, data integration, whatsoever, streaming of the data, making sure they are accurate, they are coming in real time in batches and all. Why the analytical team should ideally focus on the analytical parts of, cleaning of the data also might come in there, cleaning of the data, making decisions through the data, real-time decision. So transforming layer overview just kind of just classify both workflow, the engineering and the analytics part. And that's the point of, collaborating with different stakeholders within the data engineering team, and also the data analytical team. So this is just more or less like an analytical and reporting layer. So the final layer transform data into actionable insights, supporting business decision, visualize, explore, and distribute insights securely and efficiently. So these are just more or less like different analytical level of different reporting layers, I would say. So we have our Power BI. I mean, Power BI is still more or less like the most used, I would say, and that's because of the functionality of Power BI. So Power BI, Microsoft flagship Power BI platform for interactive dashboard and reporting, excellent for storytelling and KPI tracking. Most organizations I've worked with in the past and present, and most of them are tilting toward Power BI. And I think something amazing about Power BI is the ability. It has a good interface, right? And I would say it's user friendly in terms of someone coming to use Power BI for the first time, the person would, in as much if the person is new to it and there's a bit of technicality, right? No disrespect to other visualizations, but I think over time Power BI has been better in terms of the user experience, and I think that is one of the reasons why people get to make use of it. Very easy to understand. All right. We also have Excel, right? So widely used for ad hoc analysis, right? And pivot tables, Power Pivots integrated with Power BI data sets for governance of your data assets, right? So I would also mention your spreadsheet, which is Excel, right? Organization make use of Excel so much. And people in the finance space, for instance, people in investment banking, people in fixed income and analysts and all that, they kind of make use or leverage on Excel for their day-to-day activities. Stakeholders to management level stakeholders make use of Excel also for their for their daily activities, which is, we can say, another level of reporting also. But left to me, I would not want to classify Excel because as a proper data professional expert, you shouldn't be using Excel for your analysis and for your for your reporting. And I will just tie it down to what I said earlier. And so it's depending on your organization structure again, right? Organization structure, costing also might come in here in terms of we are trying to cut costs. Using your Power BI, for instance, on a monthly or yearly basis, you have to make subscription to it, right? And of course, it might cost a bit for some organization to. Is someone trying to say something, please? I think someone is trying to say something. I'm not sure. I think I will just continue. Okay. I think I was getting a feedback. I'm not sure. So I was saying something like, sorry, can you hear me? Let me just get a thumb up if you can hear me. I'm not speaking to myself.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, sure. Thank you. So Excel, right? So like I said, so depending on organization structure, trying to cut cost and all that. So organization might be trying to cut cost in terms of financial resources and all that. So you might want to stick to Excel, which is totally fine. All right. So we also have the AAS, Azure Analysis Service, and Microsoft Fabric AI, right? And just a bit of digression from here. I mean, AI is here to stay, and one thing I tell people over time is to try and embrace AI in everything we do. So Microsoft has given us that leverage of Microsoft Fabric AI. So imagine AI-powered tools for enabling natural language Q&A, automated insight, and predictive analytics. If we are familiar with Power BI, for instance, there's a part of Power BI now that is tilting towards AI for predictive analytics, right? And also for automated insight. So you don't necessarily have to, manually or calculate it from your head. With the help of these tools, you can easily, put that through. All right. So looking at Azure injection, we're looking at Azure Data Factory, Azure Data Factory. So injection and Azure Data Factory, that is ADF. Azure Data Factory is a Microsoft Premier Data Integration and Orchestration tools, ID batch-based ETL and ELT workload. So ETL is just extract, transform, and load. While ELT is you have to extract, you have to load, then you have to transform. Sorry, extract, transform, and load. The other one is extract, you load, then you transform, right? So it's just depending on what you're trying to achieve at the moment. Both of them are totally different. And I think over time I've seen people mix it up. So why choose Azure Data Factory? So we're just gonna look at the reasons why you have to choose Azure Data Factory. So in terms of costing, so I think I will start with effective for batch loading of your data for scheduling, right? So imagine you are getting your data in different schedule real time from a third-party application or a mobile application, for instance, right? So with the help of your Azure Data Factory, it's very effective for movement of data. So in real time. So depending on how fast you set it, maybe in a minute or two, it's going to pick it up, right? So it has possibility of connecting to more than 90 data sources, right? So different data sources, maybe from a API, from a CMR tool, from a mobile application, whatever source you are getting your data from. Low code and drag and drop interface, just like your Power BI interface of drag and drop, right? So it's just more or less like low code, right? So they are not heavily built like the likes of me using my Kubernetes, my Docker, my Terraform to load in my data and do some maybe making use of my metabase and connecting it and spooling my data and all that. So it's just really low code. So the most you will do is just a bit of dragging and dropping, right? Which I think Microsoft is trying to build an entire world for everyone around, low code tools, which is very important, and we have to give them that credit. Scalability, it's scalable, it's secure, and integrated with Azure Key Vault. So these are just more or less like the reason why you should make use of it. And of course, we look at the best user cases. So enterprise scale pipeline, built-in inbuilt monitoring. So it can be used across a big enterprise, right? So I was speaking to a friend in West Africa, I think somewhere around, sorry, South Africa. Yeah, South African to be precise. I think Johannesburg, they're about, yeah, the kind of make use of data, Azure Data Factory, consulting data firm, right? And they deal with millions or even not close to billions of data on a daily basis because they consult for some fintech over there. And this is one of the tools they use in injection and integration of their data. So we're gonna look at integration Azure Event Hub. So when we look at Azure Event Hub, is Microsoft's I throughout load tenancy event injection platform for real-time streaming of your data at massive scale. So when you're trying to move in your data in mass at large, right? When you're talking of your big data, so this is more or less like how we kind of, we can kind of embrace big data in Microsoft or with our Azure product, basically. So Azure Event Hub. So it's kind of taking large data at once. Sorry. It can kind of take in large data at once, basically. So massive scale, I mean, durability, I think there's an issue here, sorry. Durability and fault tolerant, little fault tolerant, I would say. So there are little or no instances of issues in terms of delay, replay of distribution of the system, for instance. So when we look at the limitation and the key strength, so look at, I will start with the limitation, right? So limited governance, right? CID, which is also a bit of when we are looking at the integration and the development or deployment, basically, and monitoring, right? So there are probably a bit of limitations across there. So not suitable for large scale or complex data engineering yet. So if you are willing to build or you're looking to build a proper data engineering team, you might not want to consider it, right? Because of the complexity, right? So from most of my experience, like working with data engineers, a data engineer, maybe someone will transition from a software engineer to data engineer, they would want to build like a fully fledged architecture and infrastructure. And, using this might be a bit of limitation in terms of streaming of the data and injection of the data. When we look at the key strength, one of the major key strengths, which I think I've made mention over time, is the low-code tools, right? Microsoft is building a world of low-code tools in which you don't, what we mean by low-code tools is you don't have to be very technical on a high level, right? So most of it is just drag and drop, to be fair, and which is super cool, I would say. All right, so when we look at the storage, we look at Azure SQL database. All right, so Azure SQL database is fully managed relational database optimized for transactional workload with structured data. So when we speak of structured data, so we are just referring to our data being well on columns, basically. So that's what the structured data is all about. So we look at so when we look at the I will start from the last one here, which is managed. So it's fully managed, right? So automatic backup. So the backup is being automatically done, scaling and patching with seamless integration across Azure services, right? So, and one of the important again, or the very good side of bright side of using all this is all these tools are being linked together, right? So your Dataverse is being linked to your Azure, and you can easily and effortlessly do your integrations with these tools, all right, to get effective results. So just a bit dive into Microsoft Fabric. So Microsoft Fabric, I would not say it's a new product of Microsoft. It's not any longer a new product, but it is to be a new product of Microsoft, right? So it's an end-to-end analytic platform that unify all your data workload from integration to visualization. So we went through a step of integration, injection, and your reporting layout, right? So with the help of your Microsoft Fabric, it's kind of taking all those workload, right? Those steps or layers over time, right? Into a single integrated software service, I mean SaaS experience. So it kind of limits the need to, use different tools, right? So I think that's something important Microsoft is building again. So with the help of that, you don't have to use different tools. Everything you are looking for is within a particular call center, for instance, right? So you can just easily just do a plug into it and pick out the necessary information you need from it. And I think it's really important or very, very, very good. So when to use Fabric, Microsoft Fabric. So Fabric excel, right, in scenarios prioritizing simplicity, standardization, and integration within the Microsoft ecosystem. You remember I said something like that. So more or less like a central core place. And of course, you still have to be within the confine of the Microsoft product or the ecosystem, whichever way you want to put it. However, it may not be suitable for highly specialized legacy system or organization deeply committed to non-Microsoft tools. Yeah. And this is just based down on, costing, based down on organization preference. Some organizations make use of other products right out there, right? And of course, they would probably want to stick to what is it called? Using those products. So if I'm making use of Google, I probably want to stick to Google products. If I'm making use of, Amazon, AWS, I probably want to stick to it and all that. But ultimately, it's just tied down to organization preference, right? So, and which ultimately is just driven by cost. Again, I would say it's driven by cost. So, yeah. So more or less like common pitfall to avoid, I would say. So what are the instances of things issue? Sorry, this is overlapping. I think there's a mistake here. So over engineering. So don't implement overly complex solution when simply fabric features suffices, right? So, I said something earlier on like a data scientist or a data analyst or a data practitioner is not necessarily the one that knows how to use all the tools, but is someone that knows the best tools to use at a point in time, right? I might want to do something very simple, and I'm just making it complex for myself. And you would see you spend over 5, close to 10 hours, spend 2 days trying to achieve something very simple that you just easily have done on your fabric, right? You are trying to write a heavy code. I was trying to achieve a deployment, I think, sometimes late last year on a data streaming for a startup. And, I wanted to go through the route of writing or building a proper architecture and all that. Well, seeing the fact that it's just more or less like a startup and they kind of deal with little set of data, like a little turnout of data, just because they are starting. And of course, when they grow, they would probably want to scale up in terms of the architecture and infrastructural cost and all that. So I went in for BigQuery and the likes, just to integrate and do all that. And it felt that it failed, right? It failed majorly because of, even outside of costing, because the organization could not maintain the cost at that time. I think that was one of the issue. They could not maintain the cost. And, after building everything, we had to do another rerouting of using Microsoft, right? Which was a way better for them because they were still starting up and it was very easy for them to maintain over time because it was more or less like a contract role, right? So I think that was one of the issue I faced. And another one was issue of, I think, latency. I would tie it down to latency and infrastructure architecture issues too, right? So making sure you know the best tools to use, making sure you know the best implementations to use at each point in time. All right. So I would look at on that training team, right? So I think one issue we have over time is learning and development in the organization. Sometimes organizations are not willing to train their staff, to just upskill them in learning the necessary tech stack you need, the data tech stack tools you need to. You don't necessarily have to be, you don't necessarily have to, know everything, just like the basics, for your day-to-day activities. I might be working as a finance analyst. I need to understand how Power BI works, how, I can pull my data from my Microsoft server, to make decisions and all that. So these are issues we've seen over time. So we would also speak on misaligned tools. Choosing fabric components do not fit specifically user roles or user cases, right? So sometimes it's just misaligned tools. So not knowing the necessary tools to use together. And I think it's a major issue most times, right? When you see people don't know the necessary tool to use. And I think I've been in that situation. Like I gave an early instance of a startup I was trying to do a consulting role for, trying to build the architecture and all that. So knowing the right tool to use at the point in time, right? And you know, it's quite very important. I said something again, and I'm going to rephrase it again and make a reference to it. It's like knowing the best tools to use at each point in time, which is very important. Underestimating cost, not fully accounting for capacity planning and consumption-based pricing model. So before you do anything, before you build any infrastructure and all that, one of the important thing I tell people over time is try and do your cost overview, your costing in terms of architecture costing, and is this something we can maintain over time? Not going to set up another architectural design because you can't keep up to the costing. So these are very important mistakes or picks for people make over time and should be avoided. So lack of monitoring, failing to establish robust monitoring for performance, usage, and data quality. So not constantly monitoring the data, for instance. So just because you felt the data is already in real time, I mean, there's a perfect integration, you don't need to monitor it. So issues can come up like that. I remember sometimes recently I was running a code from a database. So I said I had to do a new setup, architectural setup, and for a consulting firm too, a consulting firm, and one of the consultants reached out to me that they couldn't spool or they couldn't get data for like the past 2 days, and I was just surprised because I've done all the settings and I wasn't expecting any error or any blockers to come, right? You know in terms of the data injection and data, movement of data in the data pipeline. But when I had to check, I saw that there was a bit of blocker, which ultimately bring me back to lack of monitoring. So, in as much you've set up the infrastructure, the architecture, there should be a constant need to check it up, right? To check it up to know if there are instances of issues or errors, or so a bit of maybe the data might be lagging for some instance, which sometimes are not even explainable, I would say. So, what are the best practices? I would say best practices. Start small and scale, right? So one of the I kind of consult for startup also. So one of the advice I give them is start small and scale, right? So once you scale, of course, you would have to scale your infrastructure, you have to scale your staff, you have to scale everything. But just make sure you start small and in order to avoid large costing. Prototyping and testing, regular prototyping solution, conduct through testing to validate design and optimize performance before full deployment. So, before you go into full deployment, try and test it out, try and see, is it going to work? Is it going to fail? What are the blockers, challenges we might face when we get to use this particular tool? All right. Another one again is going to be aligning tools, right? Align tools to skills, and also monitor usage and costing and cost, right? I think the major one I've mentioned here again is the costing, right? So you have to, monitor your cost. You don't want a situation whereby you started using a product and you have to make a switch because of costing, because you can't keep up to the costing. You don't want to. I mean, there are instances whereby the pricing might get to increase, which I think is reasonable, but not doing your basic assignment of checking the costing initially before doing your implementation is going to be an issue. So more or less like a final recommendation. So focus on people and use cases, prioritize users' need and specify business problem when selecting fabric features rather than adopting every new capability. All right. So which just simply means that you should try and focus on what I would say is try and focus on what is important as at now, rather than focusing on what implementation will probably coming to change in the future. Right. Prioritize simplicity, which I think I've seen a lot of people trying to make that mistake over time. I know you have tendency of, having large data over time in the next 3, 5, 7 years, but as at now, you don't have so much of data. You don't have enormous data. You just have a very little bandwidth. So try and build something very simple that can take it in, and as time goes on, you try and scale with it. Taking me back to this previous point here, start small and scale. All right. Embrace continuous learning, right? And there is this adage I say over time: anyone that does not learn is just on his way to the grave, right? So sorry to say that, but then learning is continuous. And I think one thing we've all learned over time is the whole conversation around AI. Why, it's been very important for us to learn over time. And I believe every one of us is definitely going to embrace learning as time goes on. So so I just kind of kept some resources here we can, leverage on also, and use it for learning, and more or less like a Q&A question and answer section if there are any, if you have questions to add.